Magnificent little poem um, by John Clare. The Water Lilies. The water lilies, white and yellow flowers, how beautiful they are upon the lake. I've stood and looked upon the place for hours, and thought how fine a garden they would make. The pleasant leaves upon the water float, the dragonfly would come and stay for hours, and when the water pushed the pleasure boat, would find a safer place among the flowers. They lay like pleasure in a quiet place, close where the moorhen loved her nest to make. They lay like beauty with a smiling face, and I have called them ladies of the lake. I brought the longest pole and stood for hours, and tried for years before I got those flowers. It's a wonderful poem. It's so simple, and yet there's so much innocence in there. A simple opening, the water lilies, white and yellow flowers, how beautiful they are upon the lake. See, it's quite simple, isn't it? Using simple words, how beautiful they are. And then we get this repeating of hours, which rhymes with flowers. I've stayed for hours. I've looked upon the place for hours. And I've stood for hours. And the dragonfly would come and stay for hours. So there's slowing down of time to contemplate their beauty. And then towards the end, we see that he's been doing this for years. I've tried for years before I got those flowers. So innocent, that primitive and humble, that all he wants is to get hold of those flowers. And he sort of acknowledges how wildlife like dragonfly and the moorhen and the pleasure boat have got pleasure from being with them, just in their vicinity, just in the beauty of their vicinity. And wonderful line that stands out. And I have called them ladies of the lake. You know, this shows so much about what he's thought of them that we'll never know. He's telling us what he's called them, but we'll never know. And then he actually manages to get hold of them by getting this longest of poles. And in some ways that puts him outside of the rest of the people in the poem, doesn't it? The rest of the inhabitants of the poem. The pleasant leaves are there with them. The dragonfly easily gets to them. The pleasure boat stays there. The moorhen nests there. But although he's looked at them for so long, he's not really part of it until he brought that longest of poles and stood for hours and tried for years before I got those flowers. So there's no rush. He's not part of the inhabitants who associate closely with them. He just looks, meditates, observes, and then eventually gets hold of them. But there's a discordant note between what he does and what they do, the world he's observing and the world that he is in, which in a way sort of underlines the solitude of the man, John Clare. As we know, he spent years wandering the countryside writing these wonderful little poems, but ended up in a mental institution for many years at the end of his life. In his lifetime wasn't really much understood, but was much celebrated since then. And it's a beautiful little poem. I'd like to read it again. And as I do so, notice that the sound quality of the poem is also wonderful, although there's an absence of reference to sound. Very often, John Clare would draw attention to sound in his poems. He doesn't in this one. Sweet jug, jug, jug comes loud upon his ear, those sounds that unto May my right belong. Yet on an hawthorn scarce a leaf appears. How can it be? Spell-struck, the wondering boy listens again. Again, the sound he hears and mocks. It is his song for very joy. That's the March Nightingale of 1830, where the boy is surprised that he hears the nightingale in March when it should be in the summer. But the word mocks at the end could, of course, describe the fact that the black cap can mock the sound of the nightingale. So very often in here, John Clare could recognise instantly over 100 sounds of birds. He knew them so intimately, and often talked about the sounds of birds and rain and wind and things in his poems, but there's an absence here of sound. Just the sounds that the words make, really, rather than drawing reference to the sounds. The water lilies' white and yellow flowers, how beautiful they are upon the lake. I've stood and looked upon the place for hours, and thought how fine a garden they would make. The pleasant leaves upon the water float, the dragonfly would come and stay for hours, and when the water pushed the pleasure boat, would find a safer place among the flowers. They lay like pleasure in a quiet place, close where the moorhen loved her nest to make. They lay like beauty with a smiling face, and I have called them ladies of the lake. I've brought the longest pole and stood for hours, and tried for years before I got those flowers. Like any great work of art, the more you read it, the more it reveals itself unto you, but never do you see it all because of the beauty of its artistry and the aesthetic use of those words. But that wonderful line that stands out for me, and I have called them ladies of the lake. What a wonderful line. What a wonderful poet. What a sad life he had. I hope you enjoyed that.